Turn around. We're done talking.
I already identified myself. U.S. Marshal. Go and check the information.
You don't get to tell me what to do out here.
I'm telling you what a competent officer would do.
You've been acting suspicious since I lit you up.
No, I pulled over, kept my hands visible, and identified myself.
Step away from the vehicle.
This stopped being your stop when I gave you federal credentials.
What happens when a deputy turns a basic stop into a power contest in front of the one person on that road who actually knows exactly where that deputy's authority ends? What started as a roadside detention turned into a serious legal problem when Deputy Travis Harlan refused to accept federal credentials from the man he had stopped. That man was U.S. Marshal Adrian Cross. Harlan kept pushing anyway. He kept acting like the badge in his own pocket mattered more than the law in front of him. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about bad stops, abuse of authority, and officers paying for their own arrogance, like the video and subscribe. This whole thing started because Harlan decided Adrian Cross looked wrong for the area. Cross had just left a joint task force meeting. Plain clothes, unmarked vehicle, normal for his assignment. He wasn't coming from a bar, wasn't driving recklessly, wasn't doing anything that would stand out to any officer who was actually looking for a violation. Harlan still picked his car out and stayed behind him long enough to make it obvious he wanted a reason to stop him. Then he hit the lights. Cross pulled over right away. Safe shoulder, engine off. Hands visible on the wheel. He knew exactly how stops go because he had worked alongside local law enforcement for years. He also knew when the tone was off from the first second. Harlan came up to the driver's side already acting like he had something bigger than a traffic stop. He didn't start with a violation. He didn't say what Cross had done. He started asking what he was doing in the area and where he was coming from. That told Cross a lot. When an officer has a real reason, he usually says it. Speed, lane issue, light out, registration, something. Harlan didn't do that. He went straight to presence. Why are you here? What are you doing here? That kind of stop usually means the officer decided first and started looking for justification second. Cross answered without giving him extra conversation. Then he told him he was a federal officer and could provide credentials. That should have changed the stop immediately. Instead, Harlan leaned into it harder. His tone got sharper. He demanded identification again, like Cross had sidestepped him, even though Cross was trying to identify himself in the clearest way possible. Cross reached slowly and showed his credentials, badge and ID. No sudden movement, no attitude, no reason for confusion. Harlan looked at them and rejected them. That was the real beginning of the problem. At that point, this was no longer about uncertainty. He had been given information that any reasonable officer would verify. Instead of doing that, he stepped back and called for backup. And the way he called it in mattered. He didn't say he had stopped someone identifying himself as a federal officer. He framed it like he had a suspicious subject who was not cooperating the way he wanted. That version started going into the record right there. Cross understood exactly what was happening. He didn't try to win a roadside argument. He stayed calm and let Harlan keep talking. That's what experience looks like. Sometimes the fastest way to expose bad policing is to let the officer commit fully to it on camera and on radio. Backup arrived within minutes. Deputy Marisol Vega came in and read the scene fast. Cross wasn't agitated, wasn't evasive, wasn't moving around. He was standing there, composed, speaking clearly, repeating the same information he had already given. He identified himself again. U.S. Marshal, federal assignment, credentials already shown, available to verify. Vega looked at Harlan because the obvious next move was to confirm it and settle the stop. That was the off-ramp. Harlan ignored it. Instead, he ordered Cross out of the vehicle. Cross got out immediately. No hesitation. No resistance. He kept his hands visible and did exactly what he was told. That point matters because officers like Harlan love to rewrite these moments later. They use words like tens, non-compliant, officer safety, subject behavior. Cross wasn't giving him any of that. Harlan still kept pushing the same questions. Why are you here? What are you doing in this area? Why didn't you identify yourself properly? That last part was ridiculous because Cross had already done it more than once. By then, somebody nearby had noticed the stop and started recording. Phone up, clear angle, enough to catch the broad shape of what was happening. That should have made Harlan slow down and think. It did the opposite. Some officers get careful when they know there's video. Others feel challenged. Harlan looked like the second type. He got louder, more rigid, more interested in asserting himself than fixing the stop. Then he told Cross to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Cross paused for a second, not to resist, to think. Because once cuffs go on, the whole stop changes. He knew that. He also knew roadside arguments with the wrong deputy can get worse fast, so he complied. He turned around and put his hands behind his back. Vega hesitated. She could see this had gone too far. A man had identified himself as a U.S. Marshal, shown credentials, stayed calm, followed instructions, and was still about to be cuffed because one deputy had decided backing down would hurt his ego. Harlan took out the cuffs and locked them on. That was the moment the case really started. Not when the lights came on. Not when the questions started. When a county deputy put handcuffs on a federal officer, he had already been given every chance to verify, and Harlan still thought he was controlling the scene. He wasn't controlling anything anymore. He was creating evidence. With Adrian Cross in cuffs, the smart move would have been simple. Verify who he was. Slow the scene down. End it before it got worse. Deputy Travis Harlan did none of that. He kept feeding dispatch a version of events that made Cross sound suspicious and uncooperative, even though Cross had already identified himself and already shown credentials. That false framing mattered. Once it goes over the radio, it stops being just attitude on the roadside. It becomes part of the paper trail. Cross understood that immediately. That's why he didn't start arguing now. He had already made the key points. He was a U.S. Marshal. His credentials were valid. They could be checked. Harlan had heard all of that and chosen not to verify it. Deputy Marisol Vega saw where this was heading. She asked Harlan whether dispatch had actually run the credentials. He avoided the question and kept moving. That told her plenty. He wasn't trying to confirm facts. He was trying to protect the stop he had already committed to. Then Harlan asked about weapons in the vehicle. Cross answered directly. He said there was a service weapon in the car and that he was authorized to carry it. That answer should have narrowed the next step. Secure carefully, confirm identity, and stop improvising. Instead, Harlan opened the vehicle and started searching. Cross stated clearly that he did not consent. No attitude, no shouting, just a clean legal answer, calm enough that nobody could honestly claim he was being combative. Harlan ignored him and kept going through the car anyway. He checked the console, dug through the glove box, moved items around in the back seat. It didn't look like a focused search. It looked like someone hoping to find anything that could justify what he had already done. Nothing helped him. While he was doing that, the stop stopped belonging to him alone. One bystander was already recording, then another person started filming from a different angle. That's where officers lose control of the story. Once independent video exists, the report can't carry everything by itself anymore. Vega pressed him again. This time she asked if the badge number had been run. Again, he didn't take the easiest way out. That's what made the situation hard to defend, even before the supervisors got involved. One bad call at the start is damaging. Refusing every chance to correct it is what really buries people. Harlan had several chances to stop the damage. He passed on all of them. Cross, meanwhile, stayed measured. That wasn't weakness. It was discipline. He knew Harlan was building a case against himself, one decision at a time. And the more controlled he stayed, the cleaner that record would be later. Eventually, Harlan found the credentials again inside the vehicle, exactly where Cross had said they were. He looked at them longer this time. Any reasonable officer would have ended it there. He still didn't. He questioned whether they were real, not because the documents were unclear, because by then admitting they were real meant admitting everything after the first few minutes had been wrong. Vega stepped closer, looked at the credentials herself, and pushed for immediate verification. At that point, she was no longer hinting. She was trying to stop a disaster from getting worse. Dispatch ran it. The answer came back exactly as Cross had said from the beginning. Active U.S. Marshal, valid credentials, no confusion left, no excuse left either. And that left everybody standing there with the same ugly fact. Harlan had handcuffed a federal officer who had already identified himself, already cooperated, and already given him the means to verify everything lawfully. For a second, the whole scene stalled. That happens when the truth finally lands and nobody has a good way to talk around it. Vega told him to remove the cuffs. He did. No apology, no ownership, no explanation that made sense. He just uncuffed Cross and acted like the problem was over because the metal came off. It wasn't over. Cross brought his hands forward. The marks on his wrists were already visible. His car had been gone through. False claims had already gone over the radio. Witnesses had video. Backup had seen enough. The scene had already moved beyond a roadside mistake. Now it was a liability case. Adrian Cross didn't get back in his car and leave, because by then this was way past the point of letting a deputy wave it off and pretend nothing serious had happened. The cuffs were off, but that didn't fix anything. Harlan had already detained him, already searched the vehicle after being told there was no consent, and already fed dispatch a version that made Cross sound suspicious instead of truthful. That part was done. It was on camera, it was on radio. It was in the system. So Cross shifted from surviving the stop to documenting it. He asked for Harlan's full name, badge number, and a supervisor. He asked for the names of the deputies on scene too, not in a dramatic way, just directly, the way somebody asks questions when they already know exactly why they matter. Harlan didn't like that. You could tell. His answers got shorter. He had lost the tone he started with, but he was still trying to act like he controlled the stop. That wasn't true anymore. Once Cross started documenting, the power on that roadside changed. Vega saw it too. She was the one who pushed for a supervisor to come out. That mattered, because if she had stayed passive, Harlan might have tried to write the whole thing up before anyone above him understood how bad it was. Captain Dorsey got there a few minutes later, and the scene already looked terrible before anybody explained it. Cross still had marks on his wrists. The car had clearly been gone through. 2 people nearby were still recording. Vega looked tense. Harlan looked like a deputy trying to hold onto a version of events that was falling apart. Dorsey asked what happened. Harlan answered first, which made sense because deputies like him always try to frame the scene before anyone else gets a clean shot at it. He described it as suspicious activity, non-compliance, concern over weapons, and uncertainty about identity. He was trying to compress a bad stop into a version that sounded defensible if you only heard it once. Then Cross laid it out in order. He said he identified himself early. He said he presented credentials. He said verification was available from the beginning. He said he refused consent to search. He said he was cuffed anyway. He didn't ramble, didn't perform outrage. He just gave Dorsey a clean timeline that made Harlan's explanation look weak. That alone was bad for Harlan. Then Vega spoke, and that made it worse. She didn't do a full public takedown, but she confirmed enough. She confirmed that Cross had identified himself. She confirmed that the credentials had been available to check. She confirmed that the stop escalated before that happened. That was more than enough to tell Dorsey he wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. Now it's about whether the department is about to get dragged into a federal complaint and a civil case at the same time. Dorsey pulled Harlan aside and made a few calls. Cross made calls too. And that's when the stop stopped being Harlan's problem alone. Cross contacted his chain quickly. That matters because federal agencies don't treat this like a normal roadside dispute when one of their people gets unlawfully detained by a local deputy who ignored valid credentials. Once that call went out, the question wasn't whether this would be reviewed. The question was how bad the review was going to be. Cross also took photos before leaving. His wrists, the inside of the vehicle, the way his things had been disturbed. He got the names and numbers of the people recording nearby. Every one of those steps made sense. He wasn't collecting memories. He was preserving evidence before anyone had time to reshape the story. And Harlan had to stand there and watch that happen. That's where officers like him usually realize they misread the entire encounter. At the start, he thought he had found a person to control. Now he was watching a federal officer calmly build a case in front of him, one detail at a time. By later that evening, the first videos had already started spreading locally. Not huge yet, but enough. Local pages, police watch accounts, community groups. People don't need much when the facts are that clean. County deputy detains plainclothes U.S. Marshal ignores credentials, searches vehicle anyway. That headline doesn't need help. Once the video started moving, the sheriff's office lost the chance to manage this quietly. Internal affairs got involved that same night. The legal side did too. That's how departments act when they think the footage may be worse than the report. Nobody waits around when they can already see a lawsuit coming. By the next morning, Harlan was off patrol. That doesn't mean justice. Departments suspend, reassign, and shuffle people all the time. But it did tell you they knew the stop was radioactive. They weren't treating this like a citizen complaint that could sit in a file for a month. Cross spent the next day with agency leadership and counsel, walking through every part of it. The detention, the false radio framing, the refusal to verify, the search without consent, the bystander video, the marks from the cuffs, all of it. That's where the case widened. Because now it wasn't just about one deputy making bad calls on one roadside. Now lawyers were going to ask what Harlan's history looked like, what training he got, what supervisors ignored, and whether this department had seen warning signs before and done nothing. That's where departments start paying real money. Not because one officer embarrassed them, because one officer exposed what they tolerated before the cameras were rolling. Once lawyers got involved, the case stopped being about whether Deputy Travis Harlan had made a bad decision. That part was already obvious. The real fight became bigger than him. The questions changed. What had the department trained him to do? What had supervisors allowed him to keep doing? Had there been earlier complaints that should have put him under review long before he put handcuffs on a federal officer who had already identified himself? That's where county departments start losing money. Adrian Cross and his legal team moved fast. They already had the Bodycam issue, the dispatch traffic, the bystander recordings, the search without consent, and the false framing on the roadside. Those facts were strong on their own. Then they started looking at Harlan's record, and that's where things got worse for the county. There had been earlier complaints, not the kind that automatically end a career, the kind departments usually minimize. Stops that ran too long. Drivers saying Harlan got aggressive early. Reports that didn't fully match what other people remembered. Nothing by itself dramatic enough to force action. Put together, it started looking like a pattern that nobody had seriously corrected. That's poison in a civil case. Because once a plaintiff can show the officer didn't come out of nowhere, the department loses the easy excuse. It's no longer one deputy making one reckless call. Now it looks like a warning sign they ignored until it became too expensive to deny. Internal Affairs reviewed the stop. That part went badly for Harlan, too. The video didn't support the story he pushed at the scene. Cross had identified himself. Cross had stayed calm. Cross had refused consent clearly. Verification had been available early. Harlan kept escalating anyway. Then he used language over radio that made Cross sound suspicious when the actual footage showed a deputy refusing the easiest off-ramp on the scene. There wasn't much room to spin that. The sheriff's office put out a public statement after the story spread further. It used the usual language, matter under review. Commitment to professional policing, full cooperation. People say those lines every time a department gets caught flat-footed. By then, nobody serious was focusing on the statement. People wanted to know whether Harlan was fired, whether the county was getting sued, and how many people had looked the other way before the stop. Cross-filed. That's when the county's problem became measurable. His claim didn't just hit Harlan. It named the detention, the unlawful search, the false narrative built during the stop, and the supervisory failures behind it. The case said in plain terms that Harlan had acted like somebody who expected his version to be accepted automatically and expected the man in front of him to submit. He got the opposite. He got a U.S. Marshal who knew the law, preserved evidence, and had the resources to push the case all the way through. Depositions made it worse. Harlan had to answer for the order of events. Why he didn't verify first. Why he treated valid credentials like a bluff. Why he searched after consent was denied. Why he told dispatch Cross had not properly identified himself. Every one of those questions boxed him in. The body cam and outside video kept him from wandering too far, because the footage was sitting there, waiting to contradict him. That's the part officers like him never think about. The stop lasts minutes. The fallout lasts months, sometimes years. And every bad decision comes back in order. Vega's role mattered too. She wasn't painted as the main problem, but she became important to the record because she had seen enough to know the stop was wrong before it ended. Her testimony helped establish that Harlan had chances to correct course and chose not to. That's a brutal fact in front of county lawyers trying to reduce damages. Mistakes are easier to defend than stubbornness. The county knew where this was going before trial. They knew what a jury would see. A calm federal officer in plainclothes identifying himself early, a deputy rejecting that identification, escalating without verification, searching anyway, and then trying to right the scene in a way that didn't match what cameras captured. On top of that, you had prior complaints and weak intervention from the department. That's how settlements get big. So the county settled. It was the kind of settlement that forces a press conference and makes taxpayers pay for one deputy's ego. Cross received substantial compensation, enough that nobody could pretend the county viewed this as a minor mistake. The exact number got attention for a reason. It was massive. Not because money fixes what happened, but because money is the only language some departments speak clearly once misconduct is too public to bury. Harlan was done after that. His career didn't survive the case. Between the investigation findings, the videos, the civil exposure, and the pressure on the department, there was no path back to normal patrol work. The same deputy who had acted like federal credentials meant nothing ended up as the clearest example of what happens when local authority outruns judgment. Cross handled it differently. He didn't turn into a headline chaser. He didn't go on some revenge tour. He did what disciplined people do when they know they were right from the start. He let the record stand. He let the facts do the work. And in the end, that worked better than roadside anger ever could have. The bigger issue, though, wasn't just Harlan. It was the system around him. A deputy with the wrong instincts got enough confidence, enough room, and not enough correction to believe he could override process, override credentials, and override common sense. He did it in front of cameras. That's why people heard about it. The harder question is, how many times officers like that do smaller versions of the same thing when nobody records? That's why this story matters. Not because a U.S. Marshal won, not because the county paid, because the stop showed exactly how fast routine authority turns abusive when the person using it thinks the badge ends every argument. It doesn't. It never did. And this time, the person on the receiving end knew that, proved it, and made the department pay for learning it the hard way. What would you have done in Cross's position? Have you ever seen an officer keep escalating after being given a clear way to stop? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who thinks knowing the law doesn't matter. And subscribe if you want more stories like this.
Step away from the vehicle.
I already identified myself.
FBI,
You can verify it right now.
I need to search your vehicle.
No consent. Stop. That is federal equipment.
You don't get to tell me what I can search.
You were shown federal credentials before you touched that door.
This sheriff thought he was above the law until he handcuffed the wrong person on a lonely highway. He didn't just violate a man's rights. He interfered with a federal operation and started the chain of events that later put him in prison. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of power and real consequences, like the video and subscribe. It started on a county highway after dark. Sheriff Daniel Cross was heading back through his jurisdiction when he spotted a black SUV and decided to stop it. There was no urgent traffic issue, no reckless driving, nothing that justified the kind of stop he was about to make. The driver was FBI Special Agent Marcus Ortega. He was in the middle of an undercover assignment and traveling alone. The moment he saw the lights, he pulled over safely, shut off the engine, and kept both hands where they could be seen. Cross walked up to the window and asked for identification. Ortega moved carefully, told him he was reaching for his wallet, and presented federal credentials along with his license. That should have settled the stop. Instead, Cross looked at the credentials and told Ortega to get out of the vehicle. Ortega asked why he had been stopped. Cross didn't answer the question. He gave the order again. Ortega stepped out and identified himself a second time. He explained that his status could be confirmed immediately. Cross ignored that and started treating him like a suspect. He asked what Ortega was doing in the county. He asked what was in the SUV. He kept pushing past the one fact that mattered most. The man in front of him had already identified himself as a federal agent. 2 deputies arrived as backup. One asked whether dispatch had verified the credentials. Cross shut that down and kept control of the scene. Then he ordered a search of the vehicle. Ortega stated clearly that he did not consent. The search happened anyway. That decision made things much worse. The SUV contained federal equipment, operational materials, and a service weapon secured in a locked compartment. Ortega told them exactly that. He told them they needed to stop and verify before touching anything else. Cross kept going. When the weapon was found, he acted as if he had discovered evidence of a threat. Ortega immediately explained that it was his issued firearm and that he was authorized to carry it. None of that changed Cross's behavior. He told Ortega he was being detained. Ortega asked for the legal basis. Cross didn't give one that survived later review. He went straight to handcuffs. Ortega did not resist. He turned around, placed his hands behind his back, and let the sheriff cuff him on the shoulder of the highway. The deputies stood there and watched. One of them looked uneasy. Neither stopped it. That was the moment this became a serious federal case. Cross had been shown valid credentials. He had chances to verify them. He had backup on scene. He still chose to arrest first and think later. Then he put Ortega in the back of the patrol unit and kept searching the SUV. What Cross didn't understand was that Ortega was expected to check in as part of an active operation. Once that check-in was missed, people inside the FBI were going to notice fast. They were going to ask why. And the answer was going to lead straight back to a county sheriff who ignored federal ID, searched a federal vehicle, and detained an undercover agent without legal grounds. Cross still acted like he could control the story. He started talking about suspicious behavior, officer safety, non-compliance. The usual words officers use when they need weak facts to sound official. The footage told a different story. His body camera was running. One deputy's camera was running. A passing driver also recorded part of the stop. All of it showed the same thing. Ortega stayed calm, identified himself, gave clear instructions before moving, and never created a threat. Cross had the information he needed. He just refused to accept it. That was the stop. A sheriff with too much confidence made a bad decision, doubled down in public, and handcuffed the wrong man. That's where the case began. Cross took Ortega to the county jail instead of ending the stop on the roadside. That made the situation much worse. Ortega had already identified himself more than once before they got there. Inside booking, he did it again. He stated that he was FBI, that his credentials had already been shown, and that his agency could confirm everything quickly. Cross ignored that and told the booking deputy to process him anyway. The deputy hesitated when he saw the credentials. Cross pushed him forward. That detail mattered later because it showed this was not a fast mistake. Cross had several chances to stop and verify what Ortega was telling him. He refused every one of them. Ortega asked to contact his agency. Cross refused. Ortega then asked for a supervisor outside Cross's command. That was refused too. He also warned them that he was part of an active operation and that holding him without contact would cause a serious problem. Cross treated that like a challenge instead of a warning. The booking process moved ahead. Ortega's property was taken. His service weapon was logged. Temporary paperwork was started. A deputy asked whether dispatch had confirmed Ortega's credentials. Cross answered in a vague way and kept control of the room. That answer stood out later because a simple verification would have ended the matter, and everyone there knew it. At the same time, Ortega missed a required check-in connected to the operation he was working. His federal supervisor tried to reach him, then checked his last known movement and local agency contact points. That quickly led to the sheriff's department. Once federal personnel confirmed that Ortega was in county custody, the situation changed immediately. This was no longer a disputed roadside encounter. It was a documented case of a sheriff holding a federal agent after being shown valid credentials. Federal supervisors came to the jail and demanded access to Ortega. Cross did not back down when they arrived. He started talking about county authority and acted like he still controlled the situation. That position fell apart fast because too many people had already seen the credentials and too many chances to verify had already been ignored. The federal team made it clear that Ortega had identified himself before detention, had not been allowed to contact his agency, and had been booked without proper verification. Cross tried to defend the arrest with the usual language about suspicious behavior and officer safety, but by then those explanations sounded weak even inside his own building. The deputies and jail staff were no longer looking at Ortega like the issue. They were looking at Cross. Ortega was finally brought out and released. He did not argue with Cross. He focused on facts. He noted the time of the stop, the transport, the booking, the search of the vehicle, the seizure of his weapon, and the refusal to let him contact the FBI. That timeline became extremely important later. Cross still did not admit fault. He kept trying to justify the stop even while federal personnel were preserving records. They secured the booking log, property records, names of the officers involved, and camera preservation requests before leaving. They understood exactly what this was becoming. Ortega walked out that night. Cross stayed behind with a jail full of staff who had just watched him ignore federal credentials and push a booking that should never have happened. That was the point where this stopped being a bad arrest and turned into an investigation. Once Ortega was released, Cross still had a chance to limit the damage. He could have stopped talking, preserved everything, and gotten legal counsel. He did the opposite. Before the night was over, he started shaping the story for his own protection. He told people Ortega had been evasive. He claimed the stop raised safety concerns. He acted like the credentials were questionable at first. That story had one problem. The footage did not support it. Internal affairs got involved quickly, but this did not stay a normal county review for long. Federal investigators were already looking at the stop because Ortega had been detained during an active operation. That meant Cross was not just facing department discipline. He was now exposed on the federal side too. The first thing investigators did was secure the video. Cross's Bodycam should have answered most of the early questions. So should the cameras from the deputies who arrived on scene. The booking area also had coverage, That much was obvious. What was not obvious was why some of that footage was suddenly missing. That issue made the case much worse. One segment from Cross's body cam was incomplete. A key section around the vehicle search and the decision to cuff Ortega was not in the normal upload sequence. Investigators checked the file history, access logs, and upload timing. That showed manual interference after the arrest. Now they had a second problem on top of the illegal detention. Somebody had tampered with evidence. Cross tried to distance himself from that almost immediately. He said it was probably a sync issue. He suggested a technical failure. That excuse did not last. The system logs showed the file had been accessed from a department terminal tied to his credentials. Then the reports came in. Cross wrote that Ortega had been uncooperative and slow to identify himself. He wrote that the search became necessary during the stop. He wrote that the detention was based on suspicious behavior and officer safety concerns. Investigators compared that report to the surviving footage, dispatch audio, and statements from deputies. The differences were obvious. Ortega had identified himself early. He had not resisted. He had clearly refused consent to search. He had repeatedly asked for verification instead of escalation. That is when internal affairs stopped treating this like a bad judgment call and started treating it like intentional misconduct. Deputy Alvarez became important at that stage. He had been one of the deputies on scene, and he was not comfortable from the start. At first, he kept quiet. That is common in departments like Cross's. People know who has power. They know who signs schedules, promotions, transfers, and disciplinary write-ups. Speaking against a sheriff is not a small move. But once the footage issues surfaced, Alvarez understood where this was headed. He gave a formal statement. He said Ortega had identified himself clearly at the roadside. He said he had asked whether dispatch had verified the credentials. He said Cross brushed that aside and kept pushing the stop. He also said Cross was more focused on asserting authority than resolving the situation. That statement broke the wall inside the department. After Alvarez spoke, others started talking too. A booking deputy confirmed that Ortega had identified himself again at the jail and had asked to contact his agency. A jail supervisor confirmed he warned Cross to verify the credentials before going any further. Another staff member said Cross looked angry, not uncertain. That detail mattered because it cut against any claim that he was acting carefully in a confusing situation. Then investigators went wider. They pulled prior complaints against Cross and started looking for patterns. They found more than one. Stops that escalated too fast. Searches with weak legal grounds. Reports that used the same vague language over and over. Complaints from citizens who said Cross treated routine encounters like personal challenges. Most had gone nowhere at the time because he ran the department and nobody wanted to fight with the sheriff. Now those old complaints looked different. Not because they suddenly proved every allegation, they didn't, but they showed a pattern of conduct that matched what happened with Ortega. That helped prosecutors later. They were no longer looking at one isolated event. They were looking at a sheriff who had been operating like this for years and finally targeted someone whose agency had the power to hit back. Federal investigators also examined the impact on Ortega's operation. That part was serious. Ortega's detention had interrupted surveillance timing, delayed communication, and exposed part of the operational chain. Prosecutors did not need to prove Cross understood all of that in detail. They only needed to show that his actions obstructed federal work after he had been given clear notice of who Ortega was. And they had that. They had the credentials. They had the timeline. They had the statements. They had the reports. They had the file tampering issue. They had witnesses inside Cross's own department. By that point, Cross's lawyers had a bad set of facts. Their best option would have been to argue poor judgment instead of criminal intent. The problem was that Cross had kept making things worse after the stop. He ignored verification. He blocked contact. He pushed booking. Then he signed off on a false version of events, while footage went missing from a file tied to his own login. That is how bad conduct turns into charges. The county tried to create distance once it became clear how serious the case was. Public statements got more careful. Cross was placed on leave. Then he was stripped of operational authority. The department announced cooperation with both internal affairs and federal investigators. That looked like damage control because that is exactly what it was. Nobody inside that building could save him now. Ortega gave a formal statement and kept it direct. He explained the stop, the identification, the unlawful search, the detention, the denial of contact, and the booking. He did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The facts were already enough. The real collapse came when investigators put all the material side by side. Cross's report said one thing. The remaining footage showed another. The deputy's statements matched Ortega more than Cross. The system logs pointed to evidence interference. At that point, prison stopped being theoretical. This was no longer about a sheriff with a bad temper. It was about civil rights violations, obstruction, false reporting, and tampering with evidence after detaining a federal agent who had told him exactly who he was. Internal Affairs finished its work with findings that were devastating. Cross had violated department policy at multiple stages. He had ignored required verification steps. He had authorized an unlawful search. He had approved a detention without valid legal grounds. He had blocked reasonable access to federal contact, and he had participated in a false narrative after the fact. That report did not end the case. It handed the next stage to prosecutors. When the case finally got to trial, Cross had a real problem. By then, this was no longer his word against Ortega's. Too many people had seen too much, and too much of it had been preserved. The prosecution did not need to turn it into some huge theatrical production. They just had to walk the jury through what happened and show how many chances Cross had to stop before it became criminal. They started with Ortega. He told the jury exactly what happened, from the moment the lights came on. He explained that he pulled over safely, identified himself early, showed federal credentials, and gave Cross repeated chances to verify who he was. He explained that Cross ignored all of that, searched the vehicle anyway, took his weapon, put him in handcuffs, and then blocked him from contacting the FBI after they got to the jail. Ortega did not overtalk it. He did not try to sound emotional. He did not need to. The facts were already bad enough. Then, the prosecution backed him up with the footage and the records. The video showed Ortega staying under control the whole time. No threat, no resistance. No behavior that justified the kind of escalation Cross used. The booking records showed that Ortega was processed, even though his identity could have been confirmed quickly. Dispatch records, property logs, and staff testimony all filled in the rest. By that point, the jury was not looking at a confusing stop. They were looking at a sheriff who had been given the right information early and chose not to accept it. Then came the part that really hurt Cross: the missing footage. A key part of the body camera record was not there in the way it should have been. Investigators had already traced that back through the system logs. The prosecution made the point very clearly: bad decisions are one thing, but once someone starts interfering with evidence after the fact, that tells you they knew they had a problem. Cross's lawyers tried to soften that, but it did not land. The jury understood exactly what that looked like. After that, the deputies and jail staff started filling in the rest of the damage. Deputy Alvarez told the jury that Ortega had identified himself at the roadside and that Cross brushed aside questions about verification. Booking staff said Ortega repeated who he was, again at the jail, and asked to contact his agency. A jail supervisor confirmed that Cross was warned to slow down and verify before pushing the arrest any further. He didn't do it. He kept forcing the situation forward, because by then this was not about law anymore. It was about pride. He had gone too far on the highway, and once they got to the jail, he was trying to protect himself instead of fixing it. That was the core of the whole case. Cross did not make one bad call and then correct it. He made a bad call, then another one, then another one. He ignored federal credentials. He ordered an unlawful search. He handcuffed a federal agent. He blocked contact with the FBI. He pushed the booking anyway. Then he signed off on a version of events that did not match what the evidence showed. That is why the case got so heavy. Not because one thing went wrong, but because everything Cross did after the first mistake made it worse. The defense tried to sell it as a tense roadside misunderstanding. They said Cross was being cautious. They said he needed to secure the scene first and sort things out later. That argument fell apart because later came and went over and over again. At the stop, he could have verified. During transport, he could have verified. At booking, he could have verified. After staff raised concerns, he still could have fixed it. He did none of that. That is what the jury saw. So when the verdict came back, it was not shocking. Guilty on the main counts. Civil rights violations under color of law. Obstruction tied to the federal operation. False reporting. Evidence tampering. Once that happened, the badge was done, the job was done, and the rest was just formalities. At sentencing, the judge treated it exactly the way it needed to be treated. This was not sloppy police work. This was abuse of office. Cross had used the power of his position to detain someone without lawful grounds, then kept abusing that power after multiple warnings. The court gave him a prison sentence. He also lost his certification and his pension. That part hit hard in the county, because a lot of people who had defended him up to that point were still telling themselves he would somehow walk away with retirement intact. He didn't. The sheriff's department took a hit too. Federal oversight followed. Policy changes followed. New rules on outside agency identification, evidence handling supervisor review, and detention procedures came in right after. Internal affairs got more room to act without local interference. Deputies inside the department started documenting more carefully, because now they had seen what could happen when one powerful sheriff dragged everyone else into his mess. And that is really what this case became. Not just the fall of one sheriff, a warning. Because Cross thought local power would carry him through it. He thought if he stayed aggressive, controlled the paperwork, and acted certain, people around him would fall in line. That worked for him until he picked the wrong target. This time the man in cuffs knew the law, had federal backing, and had a chain of command that moved fast the second he went missing. That is why this story ended the way it did. Not because Cross got unlucky, because he was arrogant enough to ignore the facts in front of him. And once the system closed in, there was nowhere left to hide. What do you think finished him more? The footage, the witnesses inside his own department, or the fact that he kept pushing after he already knew Ortega was federal? Comment your answer. Share this story with somebody who follows cases like this, and subscribe for more.
What are you doing out here?
Walking.
Walking where?
Home.
ID.
What's the reason?
I'm asking for identification.
I heard you. What's the legal reason?
We got a call about a suspicious person.
Walking with a cane?
Turn around.
Whoa, hey, what are you...
This officer thought he found an easy target to bully, but he just made the biggest mistake of his career. Watch as this arrogant patrolman ignores a blind veteran's rights and escalates a peaceful walk into a serious legal violation. He didn't realize who he was detaining until it was far too late. Right now, this officer is standing over a blind man. He just put in handcuffs on a public sidewalk. He's still talking like he's in control, still giving commands, still trying to justify what he just did. The man isn't arguing anymore. He's standing still, hands cuffed behind his back, head slightly turned towards the officer's voice, completely composed. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you follow real situations like this where people stand their ground and officers get held accountable, hit like and subscribe. This situation didn't start aggressive. It started with a simple walk. The man in cuffs is Daniel Carter, 42 years old, a blind Army veteran. He lost his vision during service and rebuilt his life around strict routines. He walks the same routes, uses a white cane, and moves with purpose. Anyone paying attention would immediately recognize he's visually impaired. That afternoon, he was doing exactly that. Walking down a quiet residential sidewalk, using his cane properly, not bothering anyone, not interacting with anyone. At the same time, Officer Ryan Cole was on patrol nearby. Dispatch had just put out a vague call about a suspicious person in the area. No real description, no confirmed crime, just someone walking around. Cole saw Daniel and made a decision right there. He assumed this was the person from the call. Instead of slowing things down, he moved fast. He pulled over, got out, and approached directly. He didn't start with a normal question. He went straight into control mode. Asked Daniel what he was doing there, in a tone that already assumed something was wrong. Daniel stopped and responded calmly. He said he was just walking. That should have been the end of it, but Cole kept pushing. He asked more questions, trying to get something that would justify the stop. Daniel stayed consistent. Short answers, calm voice, no attitude. Then Cole asked for identification. This is where the dynamic changed. Daniel told him he didn't have to provide ID without a valid reason. That's a legally correct response in many situations, especially when there's no clear crime. Cole didn't take it as a legal boundary. He took it as defiance. His tone got sharper. He stepped closer. Now, it wasn't about the original call anymore. It was about getting compliance. Daniel didn't change. He stayed calm, kept his answers simple, didn't raise his voice. That's the part officers like Cole often misread. Calm refusal doesn't match what they expect, so they treat it like resistance. Cole then told him he was being detained. Daniel asked why. Simple question. Direct. Cole didn't give a real answer. He repeated the command and moved in. Then he grabbed him. Daniel reacted to the sudden contact, not aggressively, just instinctively trying to understand what was happening physically. He's blind, so unexpected contact matters more. Cole immediately escalated. He called it resistance. Within seconds, he forced Daniel's hands behind his back and put him in handcuffs. All of this happened fast, but not so fast that it wasn't clearly visible on camera. Cole's body cam was recording everything. His words, his tone, his decisions. And across the street, someone had already pulled out a phone and started filming from a different angle. So now there are two records of the same moment. One from the officer's perspective, one from the outside. Daniel stopped talking after the cuffs went on. He didn't argue, didn't try to explain again. He just stood there and waited. That's not someone confused. That's someone who understands exactly what just happened and knows this isn't over. And the officer still thinks he handled it correctly. That's about to change. Once the handcuffs were on Daniel Carter, Officer Cole should have slowed down and checked whether he had just made a bad stop. He didn't. He kept pushing. He kept talking like the cuffs themselves proved he was right. On the body cam, you can hear him trying to build the case after the detention had already happened. He says Daniel was acting suspicious. He says Daniel refused to cooperate. He says he had to take control of the situation. That's what bad officers do when they know the facts are weak. They start filling the space with authority and hope nobody looks too closely. Daniel didn't help him do that. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't start pleading. He answered when he was asked a direct question. And when it became obvious the officer wasn't listening, he stopped wasting words. That matters because the video doesn't show a chaotic detention. It shows one officer getting more irritated because the person in front of him stays calm and keeps making him sound unreasonable. Cole asked for identification again, but by then that wasn't really the point. He had already put cuffs on a blind man walking with a white cane, and now he needed a reason that looked good on paper. Daniel told him his ID was at home and asked again why he was being detained. Cole still didn't answer that directly. He shifted back to the same vague questions about what Daniel was doing in the area and why he was walking there. Daniel gave him the same answer he had already given from the start. He was out walking. That was it. No change in story. No contradiction. Nothing suspicious, except the officer's need to force this into a bigger incident. Then Cole made it worse by calling for backup instead of checking himself. That's another thing officers do when ego gets involved. Once they feel challenged, they stop looking for facts and start looking for reinforcement. Now the scene is bigger. More patrol cars, more uniforms, more pressure to stand by the first bad decision. While waiting for backup, Cole kept Daniel in cuffs and kept talking to him in that same clipped, irritated tone. He didn't try to verify the original dispatch call. He didn't ask dispatch for a better description. He didn't ask nearby residents whether they knew Daniel. He didn't do actual police work. He stood there acting like detention was the investigation. That whole time, a bystander across the street was recording. That phone video matters because it shows what the body cam doesn't fully capture from the officer's chest angle. It shows Daniel standing still. It shows the cane on the sidewalk. It shows there was no lunge, no threatening movement, no physical danger that would justify the way Cole handled him. So now Cole has a problem. His body cam records his words, and the bystander video records the scene. When those two things don't support each other, the officer usually loses. Backup arrived within a few minutes. Two officers walked up and immediately started trying to figure out what they had. Cole gave them his version fast. He said Daniel had refused to identify himself and was being uncooperative. He implied Daniel might be connected to the suspicious person call. He used the usual language officers fall back on when they want other officers to accept the detention without questioning it too much. But the scene didn't support him. One of the responding officers looked straight at Daniel, then looked down at the cane, then looked back at Cole. That kind of pause tells you a lot. Even without saying anything, you can tell when another officer realizes the story he's being handed doesn't fully match what's in front of him. They asked Daniel what happened. Daniel answered clearly. He told them he was blind. He told them he was out walking. And he told them he didn't understand why he had been handcuffed. Same tone, same story. No drama. That consistency started hurting Cole immediately because once more people hear both sides, the weak version starts collapsing on its own. One of the backup officers asked Cole if he had confirmed Daniel's identity yet, or matched him to any actual report details. Cole said he was still investigating. That sounds official, but it really meant he had nothing solid. He had already acted first and was trying to figure out the facts second. Then small details started piling up against him. Daniel's answers never changed. The cane was right there. Nobody on scene could point to an actual crime. Cole couldn't clearly explain what specific behavior had justified handcuffing him, and the other officers were now hearing all of this in real time, not from a report later, but with the cameras rolling. Daniel asked again what law he had broken. That's a simple question, and it's deadly for an officer who doesn't have a real answer. Cole didn't name one. He just repeated that Daniel was being detained while they sorted it out. That's the kind of line that sounds fine until you actually think about it. Police don't get to cuff people first and invent the legal basis afterward. At least not if the footage is ever going to be reviewed honestly. One of the backup officers picked up Daniel's cane and handed it back to him more carefully than Cole had handled him the entire time. That moment is small, but it matters. It shows that even on scene, not everybody was reading Daniel as a threat. Some of them were already reading Cole as the problem. Cole tried one more time to make the stop sound justified. He said Daniel matched the description from the dispatch call. But when one of the other officers actually contacted dispatch to ask for the details, the answer that came back didn't help him at all. The call description was too vague to support what he had done, and what little detail dispatch did have didn't clearly fit Daniel anyway. That was the first moment when the ground really started to move under Cole's feet. Up to that point, he'd been talking like the officer in charge. After that, he started sounding like a man trying to explain why he had gone too far. And it was about to get much worse because the next step was identity. Once the other officers started checking Daniel's information, the whole stop began to fall apart. Up to that point, Officer Cole had been acting like he was still in control. He kept repeating that Daniel had been suspicious, that he had refused to cooperate, that the detention was necessary while they figured things out. But once another officer took Daniel's name and ran it properly, this stopped being about Cole's opinion. Now it was about what the record actually showed. Daniel gave his information calmly. Same as before. No attitude, no panic, no change in his story. He told them who he was, where he lived, and answered exactly what was asked. That consistency started hurting Cole even more, because everybody else on scene could hear it. Daniel's version never moved. Cole's version kept needing help. A minute later, dispatch came back with the first confirmation. The name matched. The address matched. Then more information followed, and that's where the mood on scene changed for real. Daniel Carter was a blind Army veteran with a documented service-related disability. His record showed military service, medical discharge related to vision loss, and verified identification that matched exactly what he had been saying while Cole had him in cuffs on a sidewalk. That's the point where this turned from a bad stop into a career problem. One of the other officers looked straight at Cole after hearing the return. Not a long stare, not some dramatic moment, just the kind of look officers give each other when one of them clearly screwed up and everybody knows it. Cole stopped talking over people after that. His tone changed immediately. He started sounding less like an officer giving commands, and more like a man trying to explain himself before anyone asked the next question. He walked back toward Daniel and started speaking more carefully. He tried to smooth it out, tried to make it sound like they were just checking on him, just making sure everything was okay, just following up on a call. But that didn't match what had actually happened. He had already grabbed him, cuffed him, and kept him detained while ignoring repeated questions about why. Daniel didn't help him clean it up. He didn't argue. He didn't give Cole a new opening. He just listened and answered only when necessary. That made the contrast even worse. One man kept adjusting his explanation. The other had been saying the same thing from the beginning. Then one of the backup officers asked the question Cole had been avoiding from the start. What exactly was the legal reason for the detention? That question matters because once another officer says it out loud, the whole thing changes. It's no longer just a citizen asking why he's being stopped. Now it's another cop asking whether the stop can actually be defended. Cole gave the same weak answer about suspicious behavior and refusal to identify. It landed badly this time. Daniel had been walking with a white cane in public. He had answered questions. He had asked why he was being detained. And now his identity had come back exactly as stated. There wasn't much left to hide behind. Another officer said they needed to take the cuffs off. That wasn't a suggestion. It was the point where the scene shifted away from Cole. He hesitated for a second, and that hesitation told the whole story. He knew the stop had collapsed. He knew the cameras were running. He knew the other officers had heard the dispatch return. He also knew this wasn't going to stay on that sidewalk. Then he uncuffed Daniel. Daniel brought his hands forward and rubbed his wrists. He still didn't lose his composure. No speech, no yelling, no emotional scene. He just stood there, got his balance again, and listened. Cole gave him a weak explanation. Not an apology. More like a soft attempt to make the detention sound temporary and reasonable. The usual language. They were checking things out. They had received a call. They were trying to verify who he was. That kind of explanation might work if the stop had stayed verbal. It doesn't work after you've handcuffed a blind veteran in public without a clear legal basis. Daniel then did the smartest thing he could have done. He asked for names and badge numbers. That's when Cole really understood this wasn't over. People only ask for that information when the next step is coming. Complaint, lawyer, internal review, public records request, something official. Cole gave his name and badge number. The confidence was gone from his voice by then. The other officers gave theirs too. Across the street, the bystander was still recording. Nobody had to explain what that meant. Now there was body cam from the officer, phone footage from a witness, radio traffic, dispatch verification, and multiple officers present for the moment the stop broke apart. That is the exact kind of situation departments hate, because once all of that lines up, it gets very hard to bury. And Daniel knew it. He didn't need to argue on the sidewalk. He didn't need to try to embarrass Cole in the moment. The damage was already done, and now there was a record of it. The stop was over. The real problem for Officer Cole was just starting. Daniel didn't go home and forget about it. The same day, he documented everything while it was still fresh. He noted the time, the location, the officers involved, and exactly what happened from the first contact to the moment the cuffs came off. He already had one advantage most people don't. He knew how these cases work and what matters later. By that evening, the bystander video was already circulating. It didn't stay local. Someone posted it, then someone else reshared it, and within hours, it started picking up traction. People weren't reacting to a complicated situation. They were reacting to something simple: a blind man with a cane being handcuffed in public while staying completely calm. The next step was official. Daniel filed a formal complaint with the department. Not a vague complaint, not just a statement. A detailed report. Timeline, officer names, what was said, what wasn't said, and what actions were taken without justification. He requested Bodycam footage immediately. Once that complaint hit internal affairs, the department had a problem they couldn't ignore. Because now they had three things at once: a formal complaint, video from a civilian, and Bodycam footage from their own officer. That combination forces action. There's no room to delay when everything is already documented. Internal Affairs pulled the footage the same week. When they reviewed it, the issue was obvious. Cole never established a clear reason for the stop. He didn't verify the dispatch call before initiating contact. He escalated to physical detention without confirming any threat or crime. He ignored clear signs of disability, and after the cuffs were on, he kept trying to justify it instead of correcting it. Those are multiple violations at once. Procedure, use of force, detention standards, conduct. And it was all recorded from start to finish. The department placed Cole on administrative leave almost immediately. That's standard when the footage looks bad early. It removes him from the street while they complete the investigation. At the same time, the public side of this started growing. Local media picked it up first, then regional outlets. The angle was clear: blind veteran detained while walking. Bodycam contradicts officers' claims. That kind of headline spreads fast because people understand it instantly. Disability rights groups got involved next. They focused on one specific issue: failure to recognize and properly handle a visually impaired individual. That brought a second layer of pressure on the department, because now it wasn't just about one bad stop. It was about training, policy, and whether officers were prepared to interact with disabled civilians at all. The department released a statement within days. They acknowledged the incident, said it was under investigation, confirmed they were reviewing body cam footage and taking the complaint seriously. Standard language, but the timing told you everything. They moved fast because they had to. Inside the department, the investigation didn't take long. Cases like this are straightforward when the evidence lines up. There's no conflicting story. The video shows the timeline. The audio shows the reasoning. The dispatch records show what information was actually available. Cole tried to defend his actions during the review. He said he believed Daniel matched the suspicious person call. He said Daniel's refusal to provide ID raised concern. He said he acted for officer safety. None of that held up against the footage. The call description was too vague. Daniel's behavior didn't support suspicion of a crime, and nothing in the video showed a safety threat that justified handcuffing him. That's the difference between what an officer claims and what the record proves. Internal Affairs completed the review quickly and forwarded the findings up the chain. The result wasn't a warning, it wasn't retraining. Cole was terminated. The department cited multiple policy violations, including unlawful detention, improper use of restraints, and failure to follow procedures when interacting with a disabled individual. That decision didn't happen quietly either. By the time it was finalized, the story was already public. The department had to show action, and firing him was the only option that matched the evidence. But even after the termination, it didn't end there. Because once a case like this is documented in public, it doesn't stay inside one department. It turns into an example.
Stand up.
Why?
Stand up now.
What is the basis?
You match the description of a suspect.
Description from what incident?
Stand up.
I'm asking for the legal
Don't
basis.
make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm a federal prosecutor. I do not consent to detention without lawful cause.
Quit tensing up.
What happens when patrol officers force a public arrest before doing the basic checks that any competent officer should do first? A downtown lunch turned into a handcuff scene in front of a full restaurant. When local officers decided a black man at a corner table matched whatever story they had in their heads. What they didn't know was simple. The man they were grabbing was a federal prosecutor. He knew the law, he knew procedure, and he knew in real time that they were skipping steps they had no business skipping. Before we get into it, comment where you're watching from. And if you like stories about rights, misconduct, and real accountability, like the video and subscribe. Malcolm Reed was 41, federal prosecutor, quiet guy, controlled. Worked a few blocks from the federal courthouse and used that restaurant a lot because it was close, fast, and usually full of courthouse people. That afternoon, he was halfway through lunch reviewing a file when two patrol officers walked in and went straight toward him, not toward the bar, not toward the host stand, not scanning the room, straight to his table. Officer Kessler took the lead. Officer Holloway stayed half a step back and to the side. That kind of positioning tells you a lot. They weren't there to ask questions and sort things out. They had already decided he was their guy. Kessler told Malcolm to stand up. Malcolm looked at him and asked why. Kessler didn't answer. He repeated the order. Malcolm stayed calm. He asked what the basis was for the stop. Same tone, no attitude, no sudden movement. Still no real answer. Kessler then said, Malcolm matched the description of a suspect from a nearby incident. That was vague from the start. No details, no explanation, no effort to narrow anything down. Malcolm told them who he was, federal prosecutor. He also asked them to verify it. They didn't. No call to dispatch, no confirmation through courthouse security, no check with restaurant staff, nothing. That's the part that matters, because this story didn't go bad because officers lacked options. It went bad because they ignored them. The restaurant manager was close enough to hear what was happening. She knew Malcolm had been sitting there eating. Other customers were watching now too. Some recognized him from the courthouse area. None of that slowed Kessler down. Malcolm stood up, slowly, hands visible. He knew better than to make this physical. He asked again what crime they believed he had committed. Kessler didn't answer that cleanly either. He switched from vague suspicion to command language. Turn around, hands behind your back. That told Malcolm everything. This officer wasn't building facts. He was defending his own authority. Holloway moved in tighter on Malcolm's side. Same pattern you see all the time. One officer drives the pressure. The second officer closes space and helps make resistance look impossible. Malcolm said he did not consent to detention without lawful cause. Then Kessler cuffed him in the middle of the restaurant. That's how public it was. Tables still there. Food still there. File still open. Full dining room watching. And this is where the officers made another bad mistake. They did it in front of a room full of witnesses with phones. Some people started recording right away. The manager moved toward the host stand and told staff to preserve the security footage. A couple of people near the windows got clear video of Malcolm being walked out in cuffs. Malcolm didn't fight them, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to win the argument there. That wasn't weakness. That was discipline. He already knew the sidewalk wasn't where this would be decided. Outside, the officers kept pushing instead of fixing the problem. They had his name. They had his job title. They had a public location surrounded by easy ways to verify who he was. They still didn't stop. That's where this turned from a bad detention into a serious misconduct case. Once they got Malcolm outside, the officers had several easy ways to check who they were dealing with. They used none of them. Kessler put him in the back of the patrol car. Malcolm was cuffed, calm, and still telling them the same thing. He worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office. His identity could be confirmed in minutes. Kessler didn't verify that. He shifted his wording instead. Inside the restaurant, Malcolm supposedly matched a description. On the sidewalk, that turned into a reported nearby incident. Same detention. New explanation. That kind of change causes problems fast, especially once video gets reviewed. Malcolm asked what crime he was being detained for. He didn't get a clear answer. He asked for a supervisor. That was the smart move. A few minutes later, Sergeant Porter arrived. This was the first real chance to shut the whole thing down before it got worse. Porter could have checked the name, had dispatch confirm employment, and ended it on the spot. He didn't start there. First, he listened to Kessler. That gave Kessler control over the first version of the record. According to Kessler, Malcolm was uncooperative and refused to identify himself. The problem was simple. People inside the restaurant had just watched Malcolm do the opposite. Porter then went to the patrol car and asked Malcolm for his name. Malcolm gave it. He repeated his job title. He told Porter exactly where to verify it. Porter now had enough to pause the detention and confirm the facts. Instead, he treated the situation like it still needed more officer-side handling. That was another bad decision. Back at the restaurant, Malcolm's identification was still with his jacket near the table. Kessler went inside to get it. Staff tried to explain that Malcolm had been seated there eating and reviewing paperwork before the officers came in. The manager made that clear. Kessler didn't seem interested. He took the jacket, found the wallet, and checked the ID outside. Everything matched. Name matched, face matched, federal credentials matched. At that point, the stop should have been over without delay. There was nothing left to sort out. They had the man's identity in hand, and it supported exactly what he'd been telling them from the beginning. Even then, they hesitated. Kessler handed the ID to Porter. The two of them talked beside the patrol car. Not long. Just long enough to show that neither wanted to be the one admitting this had gone too far. That's what made the next step look even worse. They finally removed the cuffs and told Malcolm he was free to go. No real explanation, no direct apology, no acknowledgement that they had publicly detained and handcuffed a federal prosecutor during lunch without doing the obvious checks first. Malcolm understood right there what kind of case this was becoming. There were restaurant witnesses, security cameras, phone recordings, officer statements, a supervisor on scene. And there was already a gap between what happened and what the officers were going to claim happened. That gap is where cities lose money. Malcolm knew this was the part that mattered most. The arrest was bad, but the real fight was always going to be about the record. If he moved slowly, the officers would get time to clean up their version, soften the language, and make the whole thing sound like a harmless misunderstanding. So he started working the case the same day. He spoke to the restaurant manager before dinner service changed over. She told him she had seen the officers come straight to his table and that she was saving the security footage from inside the dining room and the front entrance. He got the names and numbers of two customers who had recorded the arrest on their phones. By that evening, he had witness contact, restaurant video, phone video, and his own written notes on exactly what happened and in what order. The next morning, he sent preservation notices to the police department and the city. He wanted everything locked down before anybody could claim something was lost or overwritten. Bodycam footage, dash cam footage, radio traffic, dispatch records, supervisor notes, incident reports, any camera pointed at that block. He knew how these cases work. The first paper trail usually tells you more than the public statement ever will. Once the reports came in, the officer's problem was obvious. Kessler wrote that Malcolm had been evasive and uncooperative. That version did not survive contact with the video. The restaurant footage showed Malcolm sitting at his table, speaking calmly, asking why he was being detained, identifying himself, and telling them to verify who he was. That is not evasive conduct. That is a person handing officers an easy off-ramp and watching them refuse to take it. Holloway's report was less aggressive, but it still leaned the same way. He tried to make the encounter sound uncertain and tense, as if the officers were dealing with some unclear situation that forced quick decisions. The recordings did not support that either. Malcolm was not yelling. He was not moving around. He was not resisting. The tension came from the officers deciding early that they were going to control the scene first and sort the facts out later. Porter's memo caused another problem for the city. He framed the detention as a field decision made under limited information. That might have sounded reasonable if this had happened in the dark on an empty street with no witnesses and no way to check anything quickly. But that was not this case. This happened at lunch inside a busy restaurant, a few blocks from the courthouse, with staff, customers, identification nearby, and several easy ways to verify Malcolm's identity once he told them who he was. The information was not limited by the environment. It was limited by the officer's choices. Malcolm then hired Naomi Ellis, a civil rights lawyer who had handled police misconduct cases against cities before. She reviewed the footage, read the reports, and understood right away what kind of case this was becoming. This was not only a wrongful detention case, it was also a retaliation case. The officers got more aggressive after Malcolm questioned their legal basis and told them to verify his identity. That detail changed everything because it made the detention look less like confusion and more like punishment for not submitting fast enough. Naomi started building the case around sequence, not emotion. That was smart. Juries follow sequence. A man was eating lunch. Officers walked straight to his table. They gave no clear legal basis. He identified himself as a federal prosecutor. He told them to verify it. They did not. They handcuffed him in public. A supervisor arrived and still did not shut it down immediately. After that, reports were written that did not match the video. That is the kind of structure that hurts a city badly in court because it is easy to understand and hard to explain away. Then discovery made it worse. Kessler had prior complaints, not movie stuff, not some dramatic hidden file full of scandal. The kind of pattern that cities always regret ignoring later. Complaints about escalation during stops, complaints about aggressive tone, complaints that he stretched weak situations into detentions, complaints about reports that seemed to clean up rough encounters after the fact. Most of those complaints had gone nowhere. A talk with a supervisor, some extra instruction, no serious discipline. That gave Naomi exactly what she needed to argue that the city had warning signs and chose to treat them as minor problems, until one of those problems turned into a major case in public. Porter showed up in earlier reviews involving Kessler. That mattered too. It meant the case no longer rested only on one patrol officer making a bad decision. It now involved supervision. That is where settlement value starts climbing, because juries punish cities much harder when the misconduct looks tolerated instead of isolated. The Bodycam audio then gave Naomi the line that broke the city's defense. At one point, after Malcolm had already identified himself and asked them to verify it, Kessler made a comment that showed where his head really was. He said Malcolm needed to learn he could not talk to officers like he was above the law. That line was deadly, because now the city could not convincingly argue this was just a fast mistake. That comment made it look personal. It made it sound like Kessler stopped trying to investigate and started trying to teach Malcolm a lesson for speaking like someone who knew his rights. Naomi did not need to dramatize that line. She just had to place it in context and let it do the damage on its own. Once local media got the story, the public understood it immediately. A federal prosecutor had been handcuffed at lunch. The officers did not verify his identity, even after he told them who he was. A supervisor arrived and still failed to end it quickly. Then the paperwork did not match the recordings. That is all people needed to hear. Internal Affairs opened an investigation, but By then, the department was behind the facts, not ahead of them. The evidence was already outside the building. Witness videos were circulating. The restaurant had preserved footage. The city's lawyers were now reading reports that were harder to defend every time they were compared against video. That was the point when this stopped being a public relations problem and became a money problem. The city knew it had exposure, serious exposure. Not because Malcolm was a federal prosecutor, but because the evidence was clean and the officers had made the same mistake again and again. They skipped verification. They escalated in public. They changed their explanation. Then they wrote reports that did not line up with what the cameras showed. That is how a misconduct case starts getting expensive long before anyone steps into a courtroom. By the time depositions started, the city already knew it had a bad case. The footage was bad. The reports were bad. The supervisor's decisions were bad. And the worst part for the city was that none of it looked complicated. This was not a messy case with unclear facts. It was simple. Malcolm told them who he was. He told them to verify it. They did not do it before cuffing him. Then they tried to explain it afterward with paperwork that did not match the recordings. That is how cities lose control of a case. Naomi Ellis kept the pressure exactly where it needed to be. She did not let the city turn it into a debate about officer stress or fast decision-making. She kept bringing it back to the same point. The officers had time, they had options, they had witnesses, they had identification nearby, they had a supervisor, they had every chance to stop and verify. They chose not to. In Kessler's deposition, that became obvious fast. He was forced to explain why he never verified Malcolm's federal employment before handcuffing him. He was forced to explain why his reason for the detention changed. He was forced to explain why restaurant staff saying Malcolm had already been seated there did not slow him down. He did not have good answers. He kept circling back to officer judgment and scene control. That might sound decent on paper, but it falls apart when the video shows a calm man at lunch and an officer getting more aggressive because he does not like being questioned. Holloway did not help the defense either. He tried to make himself look secondary, like he was just backing his partner on a fast-moving call. That argument only goes so far. He still helped put Malcolm in the car. He still did not stop the detention. He still signed on to a version of events that did not match the evidence. Then Porter sat for deposition, and that was another hit. The city needed him to look like the adult in the room. The supervisor who arrived, assessed the facts, and made a reasonable call. Instead, he looked passive. He admitted he had enough information to start verifying Malcolm's identity quickly. He admitted he did not do that before allowing the detention to continue. He admitted that once the identification came back clean, Malcolm should have been released immediately. That answer hurt because it told the jury exactly where the department failed at the supervisory level. After that, the settlement talks got serious. The city tried to keep the number down early. Malcolm did not bite. Naomi did not let them frame this as a short detention with limited damage. She built the damages the right way. Public humiliation in a crowded restaurant, handcuffing without proper basis, loss of professional standing in front of courthouse staff and members of the public, emotional distress, reputational harm, constitutional violation, pattern evidence, supervisory failure, prior complaints ignored. That is how you move a case out of nuisance value territory and into real money. The city also had another problem. Malcolm was a very strong plaintiff, calm, precise, credible, professionally accomplished, impossible to paint as unstable or reckless. If that case went to a jury, he would be extremely hard to attack and very easy to believe. That changes settlement math fast. Once the judge denied key parts of the city's defense motion and allowed the misconduct pattern evidence to stay in play, the number jumped. At that point, the city was no longer just trying to settle a claim. It was trying to avoid a public trial where every bad decision would be replayed in order. That is when the city agreed to pay $20 million. Not 2, not 5, 20. That number was not just about Malcolm. It was the price of the arrest, the paperwork, the contradictions, the prior warnings, and the supervision failure all stacked together. Then came the fallout inside the department. Kessler was fired. His certification was challenged. He was referred for review over false statements tied to his report and the gap between his report and the video evidence. His career in law enforcement was effectively finished. Holloway resigned before the department completed termination proceedings. He saw where it was going and got out before the final decision hit his file. But that did not save his name. Porter was demoted. The department could not leave a supervisor in place after a case this public showed he had a chance to stop the damage and didn't do it. The department itself had to make changes too. New detention verification rules, required supervisory review and identity dispute stops, stronger report auditing when body cam footage exists, more training on retaliatory escalation and constitutional detention limits. The city did not make those changes because it suddenly found wisdom. It made them because $20 million forced the lesson. Malcolm did not do a victory tour. He did not need to. The settlement already said enough. What happened to him was not a misunderstanding. It was not officers being extra careful. It was misconduct, plain and simple. Patrol officers skipped basic verification, turned a lunch into a public arrest, and then tried to write their way out of it. The evidence would not let them. That is the real point of this story. A badge gives authority. It does not erase limits. The moment an officer starts treating basic questions like disrespect, the job stops being law enforcement and turns into ego management. That is when cases explode. That is when cities pay. And that is when careers end. What would you have done in Malcolm's place? Have you ever seen officers get more aggressive the moment somebody calmly asks for the legal basis? Put it in the comments. Share the story with somebody who thinks these cases are always just misunderstandings. And subscribe if you want more real stories about misconduct, accountability, and what happens when the record does not match the truth.
Why are you using this gate?
Because that's what the order said. The verification number is on the page.
I'm asking you, not the paper.
Then call the listed Navy liaison and confirm it.
I think there's a problem with these papers.
Then verify them.
Shut up and turn around.
What happens when a local port officer decides his ego matters more than federal law? This is the story of the moment. A port officer made the career-ending mistake of detaining a high-ranking black naval commander traveling on active duty orders. He ignored the rank, ignored the protocol, and walked straight into a disaster he created himself. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from. And if you follow stories about abuse of authority, accountability, and people who know exactly where they stand, like the video and subscribe. This started at a secured port gate on the East Coast during the morning operations rush. Trucks were lining up, workers were moving, scanners were active, and everybody at that gate had a lane and a process. Commander Julian Cross came through the military access lane in a government vehicle with active orders, military identification, and transfer paperwork ready before the officer even reached the door. He didn't improvise anything. He didn't try to talk his way through. He came in exactly the way he was supposed to. Officer Trevor Pike walked up already acting like he had a problem with what he was looking at. Not cautious, not professional, irritated. And that was the first issue. He didn't start with the normal verification routine. He didn't take the paperwork and run the check. He started by questioning why Cross was there at all. That matters. A trained officer at a controlled gate checks documents first. Pike did the opposite. He treated the commander like he was already lying. Cross identified himself, gave his rank, and handed over the orders. The paperwork clearly showed active duty movement tied to the port. The contact number for confirmation was on the page. The ID matched, the vehicle matched. The lane matched. None of that changed Pike's tone. Instead of verifying the documents, he started pressing Cross with side questions. He wanted to know why he was alone, why he was using that gate, why he was driving that vehicle. The answers were already in the paperwork sitting in his hand, but by then this wasn't really about information. Pike had already moved into that mindset some officers get when they think backing off makes them look weak. Cross stayed calm and answered him anyway. He explained he was under active duty orders and told Pike he could call the listed Navy liaison and confirm everything in a minute or two. That was the easy exit. That was the professional exit. Pike ignored it. He handed the paperwork back without completing the check and told Cross to step out of the vehicle. That's when the whole thing turned. Cross got out. Slowly. Hands visible. No attitude. No sudden movement. He kept it tight because he understood exactly what kind of situation this had become. He had been in command long enough to know that once a local officer starts performing authority instead of using it properly, the risk goes up fast. So he kept his voice level and repeated the same point. Active duty status, valid orders, federal movement, verification available right now. Pike kept cutting him off. He moved closer, started talking louder. Told Cross that rank didn't mean anything at his gate until he said it did. That line told everybody nearby what kind of officer he was. He wasn't confused. He wasn't trying to secure the checkpoint. He was trying to win a face-to-face power contest with a man he had decided not to respect. And yes, race was already sitting in the middle of it, because Pike had every clean reason in the world to verify those papers and move on. But he kept choosing confrontation instead. He looked at a black man in command, holding valid federal orders, and acted like the problem was that the man in front of him didn't fit whatever picture he had in his head. By then, people around the gate were watching. A cargo driver in the next lane had stopped looking at his phone and started looking at them. 2 dock workers near the barrier turned fully toward the checkpoint. One clerk inside the glass booth was already glancing between Pike and the paperwork. Nobody needed to guess that this had stopped being a routine check. Cross tried one more time to keep it procedural. He told Pike again to contact the Navy Transportation Liaison listed on the orders. That was the right move. It also gave Pike another chance to fix it before he buried himself. He refused again. Then he said something worse. He questioned whether Cross really held the rank he claimed. Not whether the documents were authentic. Not whether dispatch had confirmed anything. He questioned the man himself. That was the moment the professional mask dropped. Now it was obvious this wasn't a documentation issue. Pike had decided that the person standing in front of him didn't look like somebody he was prepared to treat as a commander. Cross didn't take the bait. He didn't get loud. He didn't posture. He stated very plainly that Pike was interfering with an active-duty military movement and refusing a basic verification step. That should have made any competent officer pause. Pike did pause, but not because he suddenly understood the law. He paused because he realized people were watching, and he'd already pushed too far to back down easily. That's when ego usually gets dangerous. Once an officer like that feels an audience, he starts thinking about pride, not policy. He worries more about not looking wrong than about actually being wrong. That's exactly what happened here. Pike looked around, saw phones coming out, saw workers staring, and instead of calming the scene down, he doubled down in front of everybody. He told Cross he was being detained until he could sort it out. That statement was the whole case in one sentence. Pike still hadn't verified the orders, still hadn't called the listed military contact, still hadn't identified any actual offense. He just decided detention was the next move because he wanted control back. Cross remained where he was and made the situation clear for the record. He stated that he was a naval commander on active duty orders, that Pike had been given valid identification and paperwork, and that Pike had refused to use the listed verification channel. He was doing 2 things at once there. He was protecting himself, and he was building the timeline out loud for every camera that might later review the scene. That was smart. Very smart. Because this story was no longer living only in Pike's head or in a report he could clean up later. It was at a port gate, in public, during operating hours, with witnesses, cameras, and radio traffic already moving through the system. And Pike still didn't stop. He reached for the detention anyway. That decision was the one he was going to wear for the rest of his career, because while he was trying to prove he ran that gate, someone else had already heard enough over the radio to understand that a local officer was interfering with a Navy commander traveling under orders, and that someone was already heading toward the checkpoint. Lieutenant Elena Ward got to the gate before Pike could drag it any further. She walked into the lane, saw Cross standing outside the vehicle, saw Pike still trying to control the scene, and went straight to the point. She asked Pike what the issue was. He told her he was detaining Cross because the paperwork looked suspicious, and the situation didn't make sense to him. That answer fell apart fast. Ward asked whether he had run the verification process on the orders. He said no. She asked whether he had called the military contact listed on the paperwork. Again, no. At that point, Pike had no real defense. He had already moved into detention before doing the basic job in front of him. Ward took the documents from Cross and actually read them. That was the difference. She checked the identification, the transfer orders, the access authorization, and the movement details. Everything was there. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing was missing. The contact number was printed right on the page. She called it. The call took less than a minute. Chief Warrant Officer Noah Bennett picked up and confirmed exactly what Cross had been saying the whole time. Active duty status, valid orders, scheduled arrival, authorized access. That ended the factual dispute right there. There was nothing left for Pike to figure out. He had already been wrong, and now his supervisor had it confirmed on the phone. Ward asked him why he had detained an active duty naval commander without making that call first. Pike tried to talk around it. He said the commander was being difficult. He said something felt off. He said he needed to secure the gate. None of that helped him because the facts were already set. The commander had presented valid ID, valid orders, the correct vehicle, and the correct lane, and Pike ignored the verification route that would have cleared it immediately. That's where the situation stopped being a bad judgment call and started looking like misconduct. Ward told him to release Cross right away. Pike didn't like being corrected in public. You could see that. He stalled for a moment, then stepped back and ended the detention. He still didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge that he had caused the entire problem. He just backed off because now there was another officer there with more authority. And this time it wasn't a black commander he felt comfortable dismissing. That part matters too. Cross kept it professional. He didn't make a scene. He asked for names and badge numbers. Ward gave hers immediately. Pike was slower about it. Cross noted the time, the gate location, and who was present. He was building the record while Pike was still thinking this might stay small. It wasn't going to stay small. The people nearby had already seen enough to know this wasn't a normal check. One driver had recorded part of the detention from the next lane. 2 dock workers had their phones out. The gate clerk inside the booth had watched the whole thing from a clear angle. On top of that, Pike was wearing a body cam, and the radio traffic had already gone through the system. That meant there were multiple records of what happened before anybody got a chance to rewrite it. Ward understood the problem immediately. This wasn't just one angry officer making a bad stop. This was a local port officer interfering with a federal military movement after refusing to verify active duty orders. That creates legal exposure fast. It creates command pressure fast. And once military channels get involved, people above the Port Authority start asking questions that nobody at that gate wants to answer. Cross left to continue his assignment, but he didn't let it die at the checkpoint. He reported the detention through Navy channels the same day. That pushed the issue outside local control. Now, the Port Authority wasn't just dealing with a complaint from the person Pike detained. They were dealing with federal attention, documented interference, and a timeline that looked bad from the first minute to the last. Internal Affairs got notified almost immediately. That tells you how serious it was. Most departments slow-walk complaints when they think they can bury them in paperwork. This one moved the same day because the risk was obvious. All anybody had to do was look at the order sheet, the verification number, and the detention decision. Pike had the documents. He had the process. He skipped both and went straight to control. That's what was about to ruin him. And it got worse once internal affairs started pulling background, because this wasn't coming into the system as a clean first incident. Pike already had prior complaints. Similar pattern, aggressive stops, poor judgment, problems with escalation. None of that had been serious enough to force action before. Now it was all coming back into the file, attached to a federal incident. That's how careers actually collapse. Not always with one moment out of nowhere. Usually with one moment that forces people to look at everything they ignored before. By the end of that day, Pike still had his badge, but the ground under him was already gone. His supervisor had verified the commander's orders herself. The witnesses had video. The body cam existed. The radio logs existed. The Navy complaint was in motion. Internal affairs had the case. And once all of that starts moving together, the officer usually isn't deciding anything anymore. Internal affairs moved on it that same day because the case was too risky to sit on. By then, this wasn't just a complaint from somebody angry at a checkpoint. This was a documented detention of an active duty naval commander traveling under valid orders, and Pike had done it after refusing the most basic verification step available to him. That's what made the whole thing dangerous for the department. The problem wasn't only what he did to cross. The problem was that he did it in a place with cameras, witnesses, radio traffic, and a supervisor who had already confirmed he was wrong. So internal affairs started with the easiest part, the record. They pulled Pike's body cam. They pulled the gate footage. They pulled the radio logs. They pulled Ward's report. They pulled the witness video from the driver and the dock workers. Then they built the timeline. And the timeline killed Pike. It showed Cross arriving in the correct lane, in the correct vehicle, with military ID and written orders. It showed him offering the paperwork immediately. It showed him directing Pike to the listed Navy contact for verification. It showed Pike refusing to make that call. Then it showed him escalating to detention anyway. After that, it showed Ward arriving, reading the same paperwork, making the same call Pike refused to make, and getting confirmation almost immediately. That's the kind of timeline you can't explain away. It's too simple. Pike had the documents. Pike had the number. Pike had the process. He ignored all three. Then they got into the body cam. That's where the excuses usually die, because Pike's version of events started falling apart the moment the footage was reviewed. Cross never matched the kind of behavior Pike would later try to imply in his first statement. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't evasive. He wasn't threatening. He kept saying the same thing the whole time. Active duty orders, correct access, verify the paperwork. That consistency mattered. It showed control, and it showed that Pike wasn't reacting to danger. He was reacting to not being obeyed the way he wanted. And then there was the language. Internal affairs pays attention to wording because wording tells you what an officer was actually thinking in real time. Pike kept framing the situation around his personal suspicion, not around a policy failure or a security issue he could describe. He questioned the commander himself instead of verifying the documents in front of him. That difference matters. It's one thing to say the paperwork needs a review. It's another thing to look at a black commander with valid orders and act like the real problem is that you don't believe a man like that should be standing there in that role. That's where the racial profiling issue got stronger. Not because Pike said something cartoonishly racist. Officers like him usually aren't that stupid on camera. It came through in the choices. He ignored every fact that should have lowered the temperature. He skipped verification. He dismissed rank. He challenged identity instead of process. Then he pushed the situation into detention when he started getting watched. That pattern tells its own story. Internal Affairs also reviewed Pike's prior complaints, and now the department had a bigger problem. This incident didn't come into the system as a one-time lapse. It attached itself to older complaints that showed the same pattern, over-aggressive stops, escalation when challenged, and repeated issues involving black men. Those complaints had never forced a serious response before. Now they look different because this time, the department had clear video, a federal complaint, a supervisor who contradicted Pike in real time, and a victim with military standing and paperwork that checked out instantly. That's how an officer goes from being difficult to being a liability. Ward's report made it worse for him too, because she didn't soften it. She documented that Pike failed to verify valid active duty orders before detaining Cross. She documented that verification was completed in under a minute when she made the call. She documented that Cross was released immediately after confirmation. That report mattered because it came from Pike's own chain, not from the commander, not from a lawyer, not from a bystander. One of his own supervisors basically put in writing that this thing never should have happened. Then the Navy complaint hit. Once that came in through formal channels, the Port Authority command staff lost room to play games with it. Now they weren't just looking at discipline. They were looking at federal interference, public exposure, and institutional embarrassment. Cross had been on active duty movement. The officer at the gate ignored it, detained him, and delayed the assignment for no legitimate reason. That's the kind of case that gets attention above the local level fast. Pike still had to give a formal statement, and that interview didn't help him. He tried to frame the detention as a judgment call made for security. Internal Affairs pushed back because that answer didn't fit the evidence. Security concerns get tested through procedure. Verification is part of the job. He skipped that and went straight to control. Then he tried to justify the detention after the fact. That doesn't hold up when the video shows the person you detained literally handing you the verification route. At that point, the case was basically done. Not officially closed yet, but done. The department knew it. Internal Affairs knew it. Ward definitely knew it. Pike probably knew it too, even if he didn't want to say it out loud. Because once the evidence shows that you had the facts, had the process, ignored both, and then detained the wrong man in public, the question stops being whether you messed up. The question becomes whether the department is willing to keep wearing you. And in this case, that answer was coming fast. By the next morning, Pike was removed from gate duty. Internal Affairs had the Bodycam, gate footage, radio logs, Ward's report, and the Navy complaint. All of it showed the same thing. Cross gave valid ID and orders, offered verification, and Pike ignored it. Then Ward made one phone call and confirmed everything in under a minute. That ended Pike's defense. His older complaints came back up too. Similar pattern: aggressive conduct, escalation, bad judgment. This time, the department couldn't hide behind excuses because the case involved a black naval commander on active duty orders and public evidence from multiple angles. Pike was terminated. His port clearance was revoked. His case was also referred for decertification review. Cross gave a formal response after that. He kept it professional. He said the issue was bigger than one officer. The problem was poor training, poor supervision, and local officers not understanding the limits of their authority when federal military orders are in play. After that, the port changed procedure. Mandatory verification steps, new training on military access, clearer supervisor escalation rules. That's the story. Pike thought he was controlling a gate. What he actually did was hand Internal Affairs an easy case and end his own career. Cross didn't beat him with volume. He beat him with paperwork, protocol, and self-control. If you've ever seen somebody abuse a little authority and pay for it later, put it in the comments. And subscribe for more stories like this.